Hi, I'm Kate Mobley, and I'm going to be talking a bit about my folklore project, What Makes a Dungeon Master, examining similarities across a folk group. So, for a little bit of background, what is a dungeon master or game master? They are the kind of head of the table when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, specifically 5th edition, and they act as the narrator, the director of the story. They are the person who creates the story and puts these players into the world that they're playing in, and navigates this sort of story at the same time as including all the players and their decisions and what they do and seeing how that shapes the world. As a folk group, DMs are well, they are a folk group because they have shared knowledge, experiences, and jargon. Similarly to any other folk group, if a DM says to one DM some phrase with words that another person doesn't know, that's just indicative that that person is not familiar with this folk group or inside of the folk group, because DMs specifically have a lot of jargon that is specific to their job or their position. Um, and even within the game, within D&D, some players of D&D might not recognize the words that DMs are saying to each other, and then obviously outside of D&D, people won't recognize what words are being said. But there's a lot of shared knowledge and experiences as well of just how to DM, um, and what advice they have for other DMs. The reason that I decided to study them because I am actually teaching a class over writing for role-playing games, and it's a DM GM focused class in the position of a DM making a campaign. And I was interested in studying the origins of DMs. And if I'm teaching these people how to be one, I'd like to know how other people started being one, and the best sort of time that they learned, the best methods that they learned from the age that they did. So I'd be able to pass this knowledge on to the people in my class. When it comes to previous scholarship, this is really hard to determine, mostly because lots of research has been done on D&D itself, but very little on DMs. D&D is incredibly popular, especially with after post pandemic. Um, During quarantine, a lot of people went online to play D&D, and it's difficult because DMs haven't really been researched as a group, because it's hard to determine the quote unquote right way to DM, or the best sort of way to DM. The way that most people learn, um, as I've noted, is that they either learn from an older sibling or parent telling them how to do it, or as I did, stumbling across an online streamed game. Specifically, Critical Role is probably the most popular one. A bunch of professional voice actors play D&D, and you'd watch them and see how that DM does it, and then you could try to mimic that in your own games. So for my methodology, originally I was going to do in-person interviews with about a few of my close friends that I knew DM'd, and then a few other people that I'd be able to find on campus. However, I realized that if I wanted to find the most content about this and the most information, I'd need to try to reach the most people. And there are a few subreddits that I myself am involved in that are specifically DM focused. So r/DM Academy and r/ Behind the Screen are subreddits that other DMs use. We pose questions, give our opinions, provide content for each other that we can use in our games. And it's just a very DM focused group. So I figured that this would be the best place to post a questionnaire. And then I did, and soon after posting it, I got a lot of responses. So I'm going to go over the results that I got, and just kind of the interesting analyses that I made. So the first question was, how did you hear about D&D? And what I noted is that a majority of these were passed down from family members. So an older sibling, like I said, older sibling, a parent, a friend, older friend, a cousin taught me. And these answers were interesting because it's kind of indicative that for certain families, this is just another tradition to be passed down. Even though D&D is a role-playing game, You play, for 4 hours once a week. It was enough fun to have people from the older generations to want to pass it down to the younger generations. And if they didn't say that they learned from a friend or a family member, a lot of times they often said that it was from pop culture references. And with the invention of the internet, this makes sense because, like I said, I found D&D about over Critical Role or from online and from memes online and stuff, and that's how a lot of other people seem to have found it as well. So this is kind of indicative of a younger generation, of my generation or younger than me, using the internet to be able to find out about D&D. Then my next two questions were how old you were when you first started playing, and then how old were you when you first started DMing. And these answers shocked me, mostly because the two answers that the respondents would give were incredibly close in age, often in years. Most of the time, it was only 1 to 2 years after playing for the first time did they begin to DM for the first time. And this kind of implies that DMing was something that was worth doing to them, or that it caught their interest early on. Because in the next section, I'm going to talk about why they started DMing for the first time. And the answers themselves are interesting, mostly because a lot of the time, most people said that it was because nobody else would. Which, if we jump back to how old you first started DMing, this is fair because obviously nobody else wanted to DM. You seem like you have to do it, but they didn't really have to do it if they didn't want to. They could have just kept playing. So there's this underlying implication there that there's something about DMing other than nobody else would that made people want to do it, and made people want to do it so soon after playing for the first time. So yeah, like I said, many people noted that they started DMing because nobody else would, which this implies two things. One, high demand for DMs, and two, a really big workload, which I myself can attest to because I am a DM and I know how much effort goes into it. You put in a lot of work for, quite frankly, little turnaround, because the session itself might only be 3 to 4 hours, and you might have been session planning throughout the entire week. And especially if you have a homebrew world, which means a world that you create yourself, kind of like Westeros for George R.R. Martin. You create the world yourself, so therefore you have to fill it yourself as well. So there's a big workload that goes into it. And another reason, one of the major reasons people said they started DMing was for the creative aspect. A lot of people said they were creative writers or they like telling stories. And this answer in itself was, sure, yeah, I understood. However, when I started thinking about it a little bit more, I think the reason for this is because D&D is a less, for some, less intensive format than perhaps writing a fantasy novel might be, and like creating the whole world for a fantasy novel and all the stories that have to come with that. This format is interesting because it's collaborative storytelling. So the players are also adding their own input as they play, or at least they should, as they do things in your world. So I think it's really because of the accessible format that D&D allows for the creative writers. And then I also wanted to know what the easiest and hardest thing about DMing was. And easiest things were often the reason people started DMing. So if they liked creative writing, often the world building was their favorite part. And if they said if their answer was simply it looked fun, then often the easiest things that they said were having fun with friends. And this made sense to a degree, but the hardest things on the flip side were interesting to me because self-doubt, workload, and scheduling seem to be the most. And 2 of the 3 of those were internal, other than scheduling. And it's interesting to me that the hardest thing people find about DMing is not often what other people are doing, but it's what they themselves have to be doing. So the creative writing aspect. And there was even one answer who said that the reason they wanted to start was because they like telling stories, but then they said that the hardest thing for them were creating the stories. So it's just interesting because I think a lot of the time when these DMs start really get going, they're realizing that the time investment for a lot of these things and the workload is what really can get somebody, aside from the scheduling and just getting people together one night a week. And then this question wasn't really pertaining to much, but I just wanted to see if people thought that modules or pre-made stuff was interesting, was usable content, or if they preferred world building. And most of the time, if you said that you liked creative writing, then world building was the way to go. And a lot of times, actually, people, when they use modules, they don't really just use the module. They would pull the content and use it for their own purposes in their own worlds. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So as a conclusion, the reasons people wanted to be a DM were often the reasons that people keep DMing. They said that it's the easiest thing for them. So mostly their interest. And then also they struggle with as a player. So if they struggled with a DM that didn't want to do voices, oftentimes they're going to say that the easiest thing to them is that they get to do funny voices. And these things are really what keeps DMs at the table. Thank you.